My brother's fiancée walked into my parents' dining room like she owned the square footage. That was the first time I understood what it meant to be measured by someone who had already decided your value before you opened your mouth. Her name was Courtney. She was 29, worked in pharmaceutical sales, drove a white Range Rover her parents co-signed, and had a way of tilting her head when she talked to me that made everything she said sound like a correction. My brother, Derek, had been dating her for 14 months. In 3 weeks, they were getting married at a vineyard in Sonoma that her mother had selected, and my parents were partially funding. I was 32. I had been out of work publicly, officially, on paper, for 11 months. That was what Courtney knew. That was what Derek had told her. That was what my parents had quietly accepted without asking too many questions, because asking questions meant getting answers I wasn't allowed to give. I sat at the end of the table on a Sunday afternoon in late October, in my childhood home in Naperville, Illinois, holding a glass of iced tea and watching Courtney arrange the seating chart printouts she had brought for everyone to review. She had a system, color-coded tabs, a laminated reference sheet. She had prepared for this like a deposition. "So," she said, without looking up, "what is it that you're doing now, Lauren?" The way she asked it was not a question. It was an audit. "I'm doing some consulting work," I said. That was true. It was also incomplete in the way that the surface of the ocean is technically water. She looked up then, smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes because it isn't meant to. "Right," Derek mentioned. "Independent consulting." She put a small pause before independent that turned it into a euphemism for unemployed. "That must be a nice, flexible lifestyle." My mother adjusted the salt shaker. My father looked at his plate. Derek was refilling his water glass at the counter and either didn't hear or decided not to. I said nothing. I had gotten very good at saying nothing. What I can tell you is this. 3 years earlier, I had accepted a position with a federal contractor that placed embedded analysts inside specific divisions of the Department of Health and Human Services. The work itself was straightforward in its purpose and classified in its execution. I signed agreements that specified, in precise legal language, what I could and could not disclose, to whom, under what circumstances, and what the consequences were for non-compliance. I was 30 years old, and I understood exactly what I was agreeing to. What I can tell you is that the work mattered. What I cannot tell you still is most of the specifics of why. What I can tell you is that 11 months before that Sunday dinner, I had been placed on administrative reassignment while a review process completed. The review was not about my conduct. I was told this directly, in writing, by 2 people whose titles I am not going to put in this story. The reassignment meant that on paper, to anyone looking from the outside, I appeared to have simply stopped working, no employer listed, no role to reference, a gap in my professional history that I was contractually prohibited from explaining. My brother knew I had worked in federal consulting. He did not know what that meant in practice. My parents knew I had signed agreements that limited what I could share. They had accepted this when I was employed and seemed less certain what to do with it now that the visible evidence of employment had disappeared. Courtney knew only what Derek had told her, which was a version assembled from fragments and assumptions. In her version, I was a 32-year-old woman living in a rented apartment in Alexandria, Virginia, doing vague, independent work, with no clear career trajectory and no relationship to speak of. In her version, I was a cautionary tale she could point to quietly when the question of ambition came up. She was not entirely wrong about the facts. She was entirely wrong about what they meant. The wedding was on a Saturday in mid-November. The vineyard was called Harlan Estate, adjacent to property about 20 minutes from the actual Harlan Estate, which Courtney's mother referred to repeatedly as though proximity were inheritance. The venue was beautiful, in a way that required significant investment to achieve. String lights over a stone terrace, white cedar chairs arranged in rows, a cocktail hour with a raw bar, and a jazz quartet. I wore a burgundy dress I had bought 3 weeks before the event. I arrived alone. I sat in the 4th row on the groom's side, next to my mother's college roommate and her husband, who were kind people who did not ask me what I was doing professionally. Courtney's side of the guest list included people from her graduate program, colleagues from her company, and her family's social circle from Connecticut. Several of them were the kind of people who introduced themselves with their LinkedIn title before their name. One of them, a man named Foster, who managed regional accounts for a biotech distribution company, shook my hand at cocktail hour and said, "So what do you do?" with the specific energy of someone for whom that question is the whole personality. Research and analysis, I said. For which firm? It's contract-based. He nodded in a way that meant he had categorized me and moved on. What I did not tell Foster, because I could not, was that 6 days earlier I had received a call from my program director informing me that the review had concluded, that I had been formally cleared, and that I was being offered reinstatement at a classification level above the one I had held previously. I had asked for 48 hours to consider. I used those 48 hours to drive to my parents' house in Naperville, sit in my old bedroom, and think about what it meant to go back. I had said yes. The paperwork was already in motion. No one at the wedding knew this. I was still, officially, unemployed. The reception dinner was where it started. We were at assigned tables. I was seated with my parents, my father's brother and his wife, a cousin named Marcus, who I had not seen in 4 years, and Courtney's aunt and uncle from Greenwich. The aunt's name was Patricia. She wore a silk blouse the color of a government form and had opinions about everything, delivered in the tone of someone who had never been told they were wrong. Courtney made her rounds between courses. She was, I will say, a gracious host in the technical sense. She refilled glasses. She introduced people. She moved through the room with fluency. When she reached our table, she put her hand on my mother's shoulder and said how much it meant to have family there, and she said it in a way that included me in the category of family for the first time that I could remember. I think she was happy. I think she was also performing happiness for an audience. Those two things are not mutually exclusive, and I do not say it as criticism. Then Patricia asked how everyone at the table was connected, and my mother explained, and Patricia looked at me with the bright, evaluating eyes of someone who collects information at parties. "And you're the sister," she said. "I am." "What do you do, Lauren?" My mother answered before I could. Not to protect me, to fill the silence that she had decided was dangerous. "Lauren does consulting work. She's been between projects." Courtney, who was still standing at the edge of the table, heard this. She did not let it pass. "She's been figuring things out," Courtney said, not unkindly, in a tone that was carefully positioned exactly 1 degree away from condescending, close enough to sting, far enough to deny. "We all have our timeline." Patricia made a sound of generous agreement. My father said nothing. I looked at my water glass. "It's okay," Courtney continued, to Patricia, gesturing vaguely in my direction. "She's brilliant. She just hasn't found her footing yet. Not everyone's path is linear, right?" She laughed. It was a small, contained laugh, the kind designed to signal that she was being generous rather than pointed. "Derek worries about her." That was the sentence. That one. Not because it was the worst thing anyone had ever said about me, but because Derek was standing 8 feet away at the edge of the dance floor, and he did not contradict it. He looked at me for half a second, and then looked at his drink. My father stirred his coffee. My mother rearranged her napkin. I nodded. I said, "I appreciate that." I did not say anything else. I had gotten very, very good at saying nothing. The dancing started. I stayed at the table longer than I needed to. Marcus, my cousin, sat next to me for a while. He's a physical therapist, good-humored, entirely uninterested in status games. He talked to me about a hiking trail he'd done in Utah and a podcast he'd been listening to, and nothing about my career, and I was grateful for it in a way I didn't say out loud. Around 9:30, I went to get a glass of water from the bar and stood for a moment near the edge of the terrace, looking out at the vineyard. November in Sonoma is cold in a way that feels honest. The vines were bare, the hills were dark. The string lights behind me cast the whole terrace in a warm yellow that made everything look easier than it was. "Lauren Marsh." I turned around. The man who said my name was standing about 6 feet away. He was in his late 50s. Gray at the temples, a dark suit. He was holding a glass of red wine and looking at me with an expression I couldn't immediately read, and it took me 3 full seconds to place his face. Dr. Richard Calloway, Deputy Director of the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health, which is not a title most people at a Sonoma Vineyard wedding would recognize. I recognized it because I had sat in his conference room 14 months ago for a briefing that I am still not able to fully describe. He was the second highest ranking person I had ever reported into, at a remove, and I had met him in person exactly twice before that moment. "Dr. Calloway," I said. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said. "The Whitmore family, Courtney's mother's side. We go back." "Small world," I said, which was inadequate. but I didn't know what else to say. I heard you were reinstated, he said quietly, the way people speak when they understand that a conversation has a perimeter. Last week, I said, officially. He nodded. I was on the review committee, he said. I want you to know that. It was unanimous, and it was unambiguous. I didn't trust myself to respond immediately, so I looked out at the vineyard for a moment. Thank you, I said. You did important work, he said. The kind that doesn't get talked about at parties. Which I realize is a strange thing to say at a party. I laughed. The first real laugh I'd had in several hours. We talked for about 10 minutes. About the reinstatement, obliquely. About the new role, in terms general enough to be safe. He asked how I was doing in the real sense, not the social greeting sense, and I gave him an honest answer, which was that I was tired and that I was ready to go back. You should be proud, he said. I mean that. I was aware, in the way you're always aware of things at the edges of gatherings, that we were visible. That we were two people standing apart from the crowd having a conversation that had a different weight than the other conversations happening around us. I did not think much about it at the time. What happened next was not something I engineered. I want to be clear about that. My brother came to find me around 10 o'clock. I was back at the table. He sat down next to me with his bow tie loosened, and the specific expression of someone who has been navigating social obligations for 6 hours and is feeling the weight of it. You okay? He said. I'm fine, I said. Courtney didn't mean anything, he said. The thing she said earlier. She worries. I worry. I know, I said. You've been kind of closed off. This whole year, I don't know what's going on with you, and you won't tell me. I looked at him. My brother is 3 years older than me, and he is not a cruel person. He is a person who fills silence with assumptions, because silence makes him uncomfortable. I know it seems that way, I said. You could have come to me, he said. If something was wrong, if you were struggling, nothing is wrong, I said. He looked at me the way people look at you when they've decided that your denial is itself the problem. Lauren, you have no job. You're not telling anyone anything. That's not normal. I know how it looks. Then help me understand it. I was quiet for a moment. I can't, I said. Not here. Not in a way you could verify. He shook his head slowly. That's what you always say. And then Dr. Calloway appeared at my brother's shoulder. I don't know what brought him over. I think he may have overheard part of the conversation. I think he is a person who pays attention to things at the edges of rooms, which is probably part of how he reached the position he holds. Derek, he said. My brother looked up, startled. Richard Calloway. I'm an old friend of the Whitmore family. Congratulations on today, it was a beautiful ceremony. Derek thanked him. I don't mean to interrupt, Dr. Calloway said. He paused for a moment, looking between us. Then he said, simply and plainly, your sister is one of the most capable people I have had the privilege of working alongside in 23 years of federal service. Derek went very still. I'm not in a position to tell you what her work involved, Dr. Calloway continued. I imagine you understand, if you think about it, why that is. What I can tell you is that she carried an enormous amount for a very long time, with a professionalism and discretion that most people twice her age couldn't manage. And she did it without asking for recognition. He picked up his wine glass from where he had set it on the edge of the table. She didn't tell you because she legally couldn't. And she protected you from that weight because she didn't have to, but she chose to. He nodded once, to both of us. Congratulations again, he said to Derek, and then he walked back toward the other side of the terrace. My brother looked at me. He looked at me for a long time without saying anything. Lauren, he finally said. I know, I said. Why didn't you? Derek, I said it gently. Think about what he just told you. He was quiet. I watched it settle over him, the understanding, the weight of the year from a different angle. I'm sorry, he said. And the way he said it was different from any other apology he had ever given me. It was the kind of apology that comes from seeing something clearly for the first time, rather than from being caught in something. I'm not sure those two kinds even sound the same, but they feel different when you receive them. I know, I said. Courtney found out in pieces over the following days, as these things tend to happen in families. Derek told her what he could, which wasn't everything but was enough. She called me on the following Tuesday afternoon. I was back in Alexandria, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a folder of reinstatement paperwork. I owe you an apology, she said, immediately, without preamble. I respected that. I made assumptions about you, she said, repeatedly, and I said some of them out loud, which I shouldn't have done. I know why it looked the way it did, I said. That doesn't excuse it, she said. I was judgmental. I used you as I think I used you as a contrast for things I wanted to say about ambition and direction without saying them directly. And that wasn't fair. She was more self-aware than I had given her credit for. I thought about that for a while after we hung up. I also thought about what it means to carry something invisible, a gap in your resume that is actually a record of something real, a silence that is not emptiness but weight. The assumption people make when they see the surface of your life and decide the depth must match. The review had found, in careful bureaucratic language that I read 3 times, that my work had directly contributed to identifying a significant data integrity failure within a federally funded clinical reporting system, the kind of failure that, left unaddressed, would have affected resource allocation in ways that are hard to quantify but easy to understand in human terms. I am not going to inflate this into something cinematic. I did my job. I was thorough when thoroughness was required, and quiet when silence was required, and I protected the work when protecting it meant accepting what that protection cost me in the eyes of people I loved. That is not heroism. That is just what the job asked for, and what I gave it. My reinstatement began formally on a Monday in late November. The new role came with a different title and a clearance level I am not going to describe here. My office is on the 4th floor of a building in a part of D.C. that most people walk past without thinking about it. I called my mother that evening. She answered on the 2nd ring. "How was your first day back?" she asked. "Good," I said. "It was good." "Lauren," she said. There was something in how she said my name. A kind of recalibration. "I'm sorry we didn't ask more questions. Or fewer. I'm not sure which." "You didn't know what questions were safe," I said. "That's different from not caring." She was quiet for a moment. "Your father wants to know if you're coming for Christmas." "Yes," I said. She exhaled in the way that contains a whole year of withheld breath. "Good," she said. "Good. What I know now that I didn't fully understand a year ago is this. Silence is not the same thing as absence. You can be fully present in a room and say almost nothing. You can be deeply invested in the people around you and unable to show it in the ways they recognize as evidence of investment. The limits of what you can say are not the limits of what you feel. My brother texted me on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after the wedding. Just a photo. A trail map from a national park he was planning to hike with Courtney for their honeymoon. He had circled a section in pen and written next to it, "This one looked hard, so we're doing this one." It was exactly the kind of text that contains no apology and all of it. I looked at it for a long moment before I saved it. I don't know how to tell people what the last 3 years cost me in terms they would recognize as significant. I don't know how to describe what it means to sit at your brother's rehearsal dinner, making small talk about wine selections, while carrying a clearance level that changes how you see every room you walk into. I don't know how to explain what it feels like to have people who love you look at your life and see only the parts they have access to, and to understand that this is not their fault and also not a problem you can solve by talking more. What I know is that I went back, that the work is real, that the gap in my resume was not a failure but a record of something I cannot fully explain and am not sure I would want to, even if I could. What I know is that sometimes the people who are doing the most important work are the people about whom the least is said in public. I am not telling you this because I want credit. I am telling you because if there is someone in your life who has gone quiet in a way that worries you before you fill that silence with your own explanation, before you decide what their stillness means, consider the possibility that they are carrying something real. That the closed door is not an absence but a boundary. That the people who protect others most completely are sometimes the ones who look, from the outside, like they have nothing to show for themselves. Consider asking. And if they tell you they can't explain, consider believing them anyway. That is harder than it sounds. I know because I was on both sides of it, and neither side is easy. But it matters. Quietly, without recognition, in ways that won't show up anywhere most people would think to look. It matters.